Right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all those watching on the down the line. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon we meet this evening, and the elders past, present, and future, the Turnbull and the Inaugural people. Tonight, we're very privileged to have Professor John Kane from Griffith, who automatically went up in my estimation when he worked out where I was from in the northeast of England. He worked my accent out pretty good because he's actually from Scotland, although he's hidden his accent pretty well. John got his doctorate at the London School of Economics and works and teaches in the fields of political theory, political leadership, and US foreign policy, which is interesting in itself, given this week's events. He's been visiting professor at Yale University and has done a lot of major research work, including a current ERC linkage and partners with Yale and the Lowy Institute. So a very eminent and expert person. Written numerous articles on politics and political theory in books and international journal. Currently teaching on the classics of ethics, which is what we're here for this evening. Politics and economics, ethics, accountability and administration. So we've got the professor for about an hour, then we can have Q&A after that. That sound all right? Audience participation, does that sound all right? Yes. Yeah, hurrah. Yeah, and apologies for me being late, but as I was saying to John on the way, we got delayed by our minister, and we have to make sure that both our ministers are in good shape. So, John, over to you. Thanks very much. Give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, and good to see you all here. Welcome. The inaugural lecture, I'm very pleased to be doing it. I believe one of my colleagues, Anne Tiernan, who some of you may know, is behind this, dubbed me in for it, and I was very happy to do it. But my but is, does this work? That's a but already. Sorry, have we got control in the tower there? Worked before, as usual. I was in a conference in Morocco last year, and they were having terrible trouble, everyone with a PowerPoint, and someone in the audience said, "Power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely." And it's true, you see. Maybe there's an on switch. Okay. Glad to be here, but somewhat puzzled because this is the remit I got for the lecture. Notice, very broad. Classics of ethics, politics and economics, ethics, accountability and administration, operating a complex political environment. I think I detect Anne Tiernan's hand behind this, but seriously, if we are to address all these topics, even half of them, yeah, thanks. Tech. We'd be here till Christmas 2016, I think. It's a very broad topic. Classics of ethics, politics, and economics. You can go back to Plato to NATO. That would take a long time. But I do hope to address at least some of the main things here in a way that makes sense to public servants. I've been teaching public servants off and on for a good couple of decades, and so I kind of understand something about their typical attitudes. But let's start off, we're going to talk about ethics, and this is an inaugural lecture in ethics. Let's start off with a piece of ethical reason. And to start off, I've turned to an eminent philosophical genius, I think he is, Bill Watterson. And there he is. Now here's a piece of very human ethical reasoning, actually, isn't it? Today at school, I tried to decide whether to cheat on my test or not. I wondered, is it better to do the right thing and fail, or is it better to do the wrong thing and succeed? On the one hand, undeserved success gives no satisfaction, but on the other hand, well-deserved failure gives no satisfaction either. True. Of course, most everybody cheats sometime or other. People always bend the rules if they think they can get away with it. Then again, that doesn't justify my cheating. Then I thought, look, cheating on one little test, not such a big deal, won't hurt anyone. But then I wondered if I was just rationalizing my unwillingness to accept the consequence of not studying. Still, in the real world, people care about success, not principles. Then again, maybe that's why the world isn't such a mess. What a dilemma. So what did you decide? Nothing. I ran out of time. Ran out of time and had to turn in a blank paper. Anymore, simply acknowledging the issue as a moral victory, well, it just seemed wrong to cheat on my ethics test. You can see the human frailty there, which is kind of why we insist and need ethics in the first place, because we're human beings and we are kind of frail, and Calvin demonstrates that perfectly well. So I'm going to start off by contrasting. We're talking about ethics tonight, but I'm going to contrast morality and ethics. We use these terms kind of interchangeably, but there's shades of distinction, I think, between them, which have historical roots. So I'll have a look at them. And, okay, I'm not going to do too many classics of ethics, but kind of Immanuel Kant is behind the moral views that we commonly think of when we talk about morality. But I'm going to go further back to Aristotle when we talk about ethics. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos, which means character. Morality actually comes from a Latin word, mores, which means character as well, strangely enough. But when I talk about morality versus ethics, I'm talking about rules versus principles. Rules on one side, you know what to do. Letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Conformity versus character. Rectitude, doing the right thing, versus virtue. Virtue, ethics and virtue kind of go together, but we don't talk about virtue much anymore, but it's very important. Thou shalt not commands with what's actually the best thing to do. And I'm going to say that actually the new public service, the one you're all participants in, is really on the ethics, the virtue ethics side of this equation. But the old public service was the Kantian public service, really, based on rules. And you had to follow rules. And you weren't expected to think very much for yourself, just to follow the rules, follow your orders, and all would be well. Much more is expected of you now. And why is that? Why has that happened? Why have we shifted from one to the other? Well, we'll see when we understand what ethics actually means, as opposed to rule-following morality. Aristotle lived a long time ago. This is BC. BCE they call it these days, but used to mean before Christ, before the birth of Christ. 384 years before the birth of Christ, Aristotle was born. Aristotle's one of those universal geniuses. Most of the learning and thinking that we do today can be traced back to Aristotle. It doesn't even matter what the field is. Physics, Aristotle invented physics. Biology, he was the first one to dissect animals and try and find out how they worked. You want to know something about drama, the theatre? Aristotle wrote the book. You want to understand about politics and rhetoric? Aristotle wrote the book. He covered almost everything. He had an ambition to be astronomy. The birth of astronomy starts with Aristotle, understanding the heavens, the movements of the heavens. Now, much of Aristotle's science is no longer relevant to us, even though the roots of our science come from Aristotle. He was rediscovered. He was lost for many years, Aristotle, all his books, but rediscovered through Christian contact with the Arabic civilization of the Middle Ages, which had kept his works and books. And he was like a dawning of light in the 13th century when they discovered this ancient learning which had been lost for centuries and centuries. So he was tremendously important in giving a boost to our Western civilization and all that it means in this latter day. Now, as I said before, his science, no one takes seriously Aristotelian science anymore, but they do take seriously his ethics and his politics. There's something about ethics and politics which, being human beings, I think, doesn't change very much, actually, across the centuries. We can still learn a lot about it. We can learn a lot about political rhetoric. If we read Aristotle's book on rhetoric, I don't think anyone's actually improved very much. If you think about the politicians who you all work for a politician, and you love politicians, I know that. I've spoken to many public servants, and they all love politicians. Pretty much like pretty much like the average Australian. Ask the average Australian what they think of a politician. Liars. You know. Well, are they really liars? Aristotle said that rhetoric is very important, particularly in a democratic ethos. Why is it important? It doesn't really matter much in China. You try to suppress rhetoric, actually. You don't want people talking and talking back. You want people doing what they're told. Under a tyranny, you don't get to talk much. But in a democracy, you actually have to convince people. The only way you can lead in a democracy is by persuading us, the people. Therefore, rhetoric is absolutely fundamental. And rhetoric, of course, Aristotle says three things in any rhetoric. What's going to convince you by something I say? Well, the first thing is what Aristotle called ethos, this word we get ethics from. Do you trust me? Do I look like the sort of character that's trustworthy? This is what we do when we look at our politicians. They get on TV. Are they looking a little shifty? Or are they talking to us straight? You've seen over the last 10 years of disastrous politics in Australia, many, many characters on television close up, looking rather shifty, rather slippery and so forth, and don't quite trust them. So that's important. That's the first thing. Do I have a good argument? What Aristotle called the logos. I'll be convinced by a good argument. Now, but even that's not enough, you see. A good argument's good. Yeah, I buy that. Yeah, I think that person's trustworthy. Got 2 strikes, but you need another one. What if I don't care about what you're talking about? I have to care. And the rhetorician has to make you care. It's what's called the pathos, the feeling. I have to touch you somewhere in your feelings so that my argument and my character get through to you and make something happen. And therefore rhetoric is fundamentally important. Think about that next time you're watching Malcolm. It's been a large turnaround, as you know, in Australian politics. Well, many large turnarounds in recent years, but a very, very important one just recently. And it's very interesting to watch Tony Abbott's style versus Malcolm Turnbull's style. One of the first things they said about Malcolm when he was in front of the cameras after the coup, if we can call it a coup, that's what Tony Abbott calls it, I think. They said, well, he answers questions. That's a surprise. It's not just a talking point anymore. Malcolm actually seems, when someone asks him a question, suddenly seems to be thinking about it and thinking, well, and gives a reasoned argument, and you think, this isn't just scripted anymore. This isn't just the normal politics. Where's the sound bites? We don't hand out to the politicians every morning, when they stick a microphone under your face today, this is what you say, and you keep repeating it till everyone's sick of it. Malcolm's doing something else. And he's refusing to be, the gotcha moment. Who was it? Someone asked Tony Morrison, Morrison, the new treasurer, when are we going to get into surplus? And he said, when our revenues exceed our expenditures. Clever politics, you see, because, Wayne Swan got hoist by promising a surplus that he could never deliver. And you don't promise in politics what you don't know you can't deliver. Now, these are all important things in politics. Now, Aristotle has a great deal to say about this kind of thing. So it's worth going back to Aristotle. Now, what's interesting in Aristotle, he wrote many famous books, but one of the most famous one is called Nicomachean Ethics. Don't worry about the Nicomachean, but it's a book on ethics, quite a thick book on ethics. And it talks about the virtues, and it talks about this thing called prudence. I'll talk about prudence in a little bit, because it's fundamental to, I think, to your business in the modern day administration, where we'll talk about it. But ethics was a foundation for politics for Aristotle. He said, I have to write the book on ethics first, and then my second book is called, guess what? The Politics. Why? Because ethics is a foundation. Do we think that anymore? No, I'm going to try and convince you actually today that actually it's true. And we tend to think, morality and politics don't really go together, do they? Sort of oxymoron. Well, it's not actually, and I'll show you why. And let's remember that when we talk about the government, you're it. And the way you act is an act of government. When you act, you're acting as a part of the government. So you're not innocent here. You're a player. Phronesis is this concept that Aristotle deploys in the Ethics and says practical wisdom. This is the difference between a morality. Immanuel Kant said, it's a law-based, Immanuel Kant, morality is kind of law-based. The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc. Mostly thou shalt. Sometimes thou shalt, but sometimes thou shalt not. So it's kind of a rule. You follow the rule. And Kant was very much like this. He believed you could derive, we knew what the rules of morality were, our reason told us what they were, and, for instance, you don't lie, because if everyone lied, we wouldn't be able to live, would we? Couldn't trust anyone. Society couldn't survive. Therefore, do not lie. And that's a rule. It's an absolute moral rule. And someone asked Kant, yes, but, someone comes and gives you their guns and said, look, I'm going out to get drunk, look after my guns. And then they knock on your door, and say, give me my guns back. No, I've lost them. Kant said you can't do that. You must not tell a lie even under those circumstances. Now, Aristotle would have laughed his head off at that. Don't be stupid. That's not wise. You might be following a rule, but it's not wise. Now, how do we know then? Practical wisdom is something larger than following rules. And Aristotle knew this very well. He knew we needed laws. We need laws because, you're in main roads, we have road rules. Why do we have road rules? Because it brings order. Well, I was just talking to Tan, your girl there, and she comes from Thailand, of course, and she says no rules there on the road. It's a different set. But we have road rules. Everyone has to obey them and follow them. Why? Because it's sensible. And, they're externally imposed upon us. And we, get prosecuted if we don't obey them when we get caught. Perfectly right that society needs those rules. But for most of the things that are really important in life is complex, life is difficult, a rule won't do. A simple rule won't do. Because life throws all sorts of things at you and you have to adjust and it's very complicated. How do you know what's the best thing to do in particular circumstances? And circumstances change all the time. Chaotic sometimes. Don't know what we're doing, which way we're going. How do we know? Now, I'd put it to you that when you think about it, think about the people you know. Think about the people, when it comes to the crunch, who you trust. To bit of a jam, difficult decision has to be made. Would you talk to that person, but not that person? Because you judge that person a bit of a ratbag. But this person over here, their record says, good head on their shoulders, always gives good advice. You kind of know in your life. We all assess each other all the time for character. That's what I'm talking about. We do it automatically, fundamentally. We need to. Our survival sometimes depends on reading the character of the person who's come into the room or is walking down the road or whatever. We need to read people's characters. And we judge all the time. Judge not lest you be judged, the Bible says. But we judge all the time, and we have to. We do it instinctively, automatically, and it's very important to our lives. But how do we judge? Well, we judge largely through experience. And phronesis, practical wisdom, which comes down to us, the Latins translated the Greek as prudentia, and it comes down to us as prudence, which sounds like a very kind of narrow, I was going to say a banker's virtue, but not anymore really. Once upon a time, the old-fashioned bankers, prudence was their chief virtue. But it's a much, much broader thing for Aristotle. Aristotle thinks actually you have to have all the virtues, courage, temperance, fortitude, intelligence, if you're going to be practically wise. And you have to be experienced. He said, children, young upstarts, can be very, very clever, do mathematics wonderfully well, amazing, but don't take their advice. They won't be wise. You have to have long experience in life to be wise. And you will identify those who are wise, and it's a good idea to identify them and listen to them and possibly follow them. So there's kind of concept of leadership going on in here too. So jurisprudence, anyone done law here or familiar with the law? This is what judges do. Judges have to decide case by case by case. And of course there's a million laws out there, statute law. There's a whole history of common law come down to the judge to decide on a particular case. But as any lawyer will tell you, and if you've seen all the legal shows on television, you know, cases are very similar, but they're also distinctively different. And the judge has to decide, does that case apply in this case? Is it exactly the same? Would the same rule apply here? Sort of, but not quite. I have to make a decision on this particular case with all that barrage of statute law and common law behind me. That's prudence. We use the term. Prudence, juris, law, prudence, law. Wisdom of the law. And that wisdom is supposed to reside in the learned judge, who sat on many, many cases, over a long period of time, has come up through the ranks. He's done his law degree or her law degree, originally has had a practice, has been put on a lower bench, has worked their way up to the higher bench and so forth, very eminent, because they're able to apply the law in this prudential fashion. So this is practically very important. Judges do it, of course, but I'm saying we all actually need to do it. You do have a Public Sector Ethics Act. Actually, once upon a time, if you looked at the public sector codes of conduct, they were pretty much codes of conduct, rules, basically. What value of gift can you accept from a client? $15 or something, not much. All those kind of things, and laying it down, and no doubt they still exist. But if you look at the Public Sector Ethics Act of 1994, this is part 3, which applies to all of you, it lays down not rules but principles. Ethics principles of the public service are integrity and impartiality. Does that surprise anyone? No, of course not. If you go to this section, by the way, you'll find it online. You'll find each of these got a few paragraphs which explains and elaborates upon them, in case you didn't know precisely what they meant. Promoting the public good, commitment to the system of government, and we'll talk about the system of government in a moment. Accountability and transparency, these are classic virtues of the public service. Integrity, impartiality, but they're just, if you just think about it for a little while, they're very bound to our particular civilization. Once upon a time, if and there's many, many countries in the world now, you say you have to have integrity and be impartial. I'd say, what? What about my cousin? What about my brother? He needs a job. If he's any good, it doesn't matter. My family needs to be looked after. Your family comes first. Your clan comes first. You're not supposed to be impartial. You're doing the wrong thing if you're impartial. And you in your private life will feel much the same. You have to look after your family. They should come first. But in your job, in your public service job, no, you can't do that. So we've developed this kind of principle of impartiality, which you will find in a lot of places. And I was talking to someone yesterday, the day before, who's been in Malaysia for many years. He says, of course, all terribly corrupt, He says, but the good thing about corruption in Malaysia, he says, unlike other parts of the world, he says, corruption goes all the way down. So, even the lowest people have a little bit of corruption, and so everyone's kind of happy and they kind of get on with it. But we try to discourage that kind of thing in our system. Promoting the public good, this seems obvious, doesn't it? Except, I'm going to say that, make the argument, as I said before, that we've moved from a rule-based system of public service to an ethics-based public service, to really a virtues public service. But it was a kind of curious and difficult transition. None of you are old enough here, I don't think, to have known the old public service, Queensland Public Service. 1993 it began to change, rather later than other parts in the world, but it did change. But the old bureaucracy was, the usual bureaucracy, as I said before. You left school at grade 10, you did your public service exam, you went to work, you had your in-tray and your out-tray, you obeyed orders. It wasn't your business to think, just to do your job and go home and be very happy. And at 65, you got your gold watch and went off fishing and died. That was the old public service. But now, under the theory of what was called New Public Management, which swept the world about 3 decades or so ago, and let's face it, the old bureaucracy had a lot of sins. It was rather creaky and chaotic, and not chaotic, but sclerotic. Trying to get something done was in triplicate, was a horrible nightmare. And so we wanted a new kind of public service. And who did administration and management better than the public service? Who? What was the answer to that? That was given. Neil knows, he nods. What was the answer that was given to that? Who does management better than public servants?
Commercial sector.
Business. Yeah. And they have to, because they don't make a profit, they die. Therefore, they have to manage things better. Let's look to the private sector to apply rules, take the rules and the learnings from the private sector, apply them to the public sector. And there was a whole fad and fashion for, changing, getting rid of your own transport fleet. Why do you need that? We'll hire people who do that. A private business, and they'll run it better and more efficiently than you would. Governments don't run things efficiently, but private sector has to. Therefore, you'll save money, be more efficient, everyone will be happier. And we'll bring kind of quasi-market rules into the public service itself. Market discipline. We don't have real market discipline, but we'll pretend we have, and you'll do things better. And by the way, it's not, you used to be public servants, but then, don't like that word very much. You don't call, people in private sector servants, do you? They're masters of their own destiny. So you'll be public sector workers. And somewhere in this idea, the old values of public service, which were genuine values, and many public servants held to them very firmly, they thought they were there to serve the public. That's why you become a public servant. No, I'm a public sector worker, just like anyone else. Well, I say no, you're not, actually. You can't be like anyone else. There's one good reason why you can't be like anyone else in the private sector. What's the difference? What's the fundamental difference between the private sector and the public sector, actually? What's the real crucial difference that makes you in this organisation, not like a private sector worker?
Not profit-driven.
And that's very important. Although they try to make you a bit profit-driven sometimes, and they try to make you kind of entrepreneurial, sometimes disastrously. But what makes you distinct? Think of the great, BHP. Bit of trouble at the moment in South America, but leave that aside. Huge company. Bill Gates, richest man in the world. Yeah? Wants to sell you stuff, doesn't he? Can he make you buy his things? No? Okay, what's the difference between him and government? That's right. You can forget this easily because you're such a nice lot of people and so benign, but you're actually part of a coercive institution, the only coercive institution. Bill Gates cannot be coercive. If he is, he'll be put away by government. Government has authority in a way private sector can never have authority. Bill will try to seduce you, entice you, play all sorts of tricks to make you buy their stuff, but he can't make you do anything. Only government can do that. That's why we have laws. That's what law means. That's what authority means. And you're part of this authoritative apparatus. You don't feel like a big bully, and of course you're not. But you must not forget that. So when you have a position of authority, why have you got that authority? And you know where the money comes from. It's your money and our money. It's public money. Yeah? You can't. This has happened in the past where someone in the Queensland government had a gold toilet seat and got on the front page of the Courier Mail. Scandal, horror, what? How dare you spend public money on a gold toilet seat? Who do you think you are? You can't do that in the public sector. If Bill Gates wants to do it, of course he's got a $100 million mansion. He can do what he likes with money. Yeah? You can't. You are of the government, and the government is special. It's special because it is the authority given to it in our political theory, given to it by the very public you serve. They have given you authority, but it's genuine authority, and it's coercive authority. Now, you don't want to use it too much. You'd rather not use it, but sometimes we do use it and have to use it, of course. Commitment to the system of government, yes, it's interesting. When people get surveyed, as they often do these days about everything, there's always an interesting discrepancy. As I said before, what do you think of your politicians? Hate them. What do you think of your system of government? Best in the world. Funny that, isn't it? Always comes up that way. Yeah, the system of government's really, really good, but gee, the people in it, aren't they rotten? Isn't that strange? Well, maybe we'll think about why that is so. Accountability, this is the great, again, you are accountable in a way that people, when your bottom line in the private sector is what makes you accountable. If you fail, you go down, you're dead, unless the government comes in and saves you, of course. Government's terrible for business until business is dying, and then they want the government to do something about it. That's typical. This is typical of the strange relationship we have between what we call the private sector and the public sector. But accountability, this is a peculiar public sector. Again, because you're using public money, you have to show what you're doing with it and why you're doing what you're doing with it. No way out of this. Transparency, that's a good one, isn't it? You like to be transparent? Can we see through you in the transport and main roads? All governments, all democratic governments have to be transparent because they are servants of the people. And if you're servants, if you have a servant, you don't want your servant hiding stuff from you. You want to see what they're doing. And people always demand, transparency of their government. Funny how they don't often get it though, isn't it? Why is that? Governments tend to, once you're in power, we have Freedom of Information Act and all that kind of stuff, but it's actually quite difficult to hold on to the transparency thing. You will give it lip service, you will say it's very important, it is very important, but then there will be plenty of things which you just have to hide, otherwise you won't get anything done. But that's an ethical issue. It's a perennial one. We perhaps won't go into it tonight at any depth, but it is an important one. Code of Conduct for the Queensland Public Service 2011. If you have a look at that, you'll see all these ones pursued in greater detail. So, ethical politics, is that a contradiction in terms? I'm saying no, it's not. Ethics is fundamental. People distrust politicians, generally speaking. They want to trust them. In your heart of hearts, you really want Malcolm to do a good job, don't you? After the years of the wilderness under Rudd, Tony Abbott. What a relief. We've got a human being in charge. Someone who seems to know what they're doing. You hope, but you might be disappointed. End of next year, Malcolm might have disappointed you too. We tend to be disappointed, to invest great hopes for leadership, for honesty, for transparency, all these things we want, but we tend not to get it. Politics is very difficult, actually. And democratic politics is the most difficult form of politics of all. And if you want to ask questions about that later on, please do, because I've written a whole book about it. So what's the relation between politics and policy? Well, I say you're a coercive body, and policy is absolutely central to what government does, isn't it? Yes? Why is it? Simple question. As my grandmother would have said, I knew until you asked me. What's policy, and why is it central to government? You have
choices.
It's all about choices. A policy is a policy choice, isn't it? You can do this or you can do that. You're going to do this rather than that. Yeah? You're going to do this, but how are you going to do it? That's another part of policy. There might be 5, 10 ways of doing the same thing. How do you choose which one? Well, it's policy. Why do you work policy out in this way? We're going to do this, not that, and we're going to do it this way rather than that way. Why does government want you to do this? Sorry?
Yeah, consistency. It's all about getting a consistent outcome, balancing up a few competing interests.
Competing interests, yes, but why does government want you to do it?
Predictability.
What they're elected to do.
Yeah. They have to justify themselves. They're put there to do stuff. And they have to have a program. Politicians hate it. If something comes out of left field they haven't expected, and they race around saying, have we got a policy for this? Have we got a policy for that? Somewhere in the bottom drawer we must have a policy. Why? Because they have to explain themselves to the people all the time. Yeah? When you hear, if you ever hear on the TV or the radio, the minister was not available for comment today, you think, he's got something to hide, hasn't he? You've got to front up every day, and you've got to explain yourself. In the 24/7 news cycle, this is terribly wearing on our politicians. But they have to do it. If they don't, we're suspicious immediately. Have to explain themselves. Why are you doing this? Why are you building this railway to that coal mine up near Gladstone somewhere? Yeah. Why are you doing that? Yeah. Well, you see, jobs, employment. They've got all done. Our policy is going to deliver this. It's a choice. It's a choice. I'm fulfilling my promise to you and my responsibility to you as a leader, servant leader to you, and I'm explaining to you why it has to be done. So we need policy. Ministers need policy. Politicians need policy. precisely to justify what they're doing. And they feel very uncomfortable if they're in a policy-free zone, as often they are. What's the opposite of policy, actually? If you didn't have policies, what would you be doing? Over the years, I've been surprised how much governments do. Before you start exploring all the nooks and crannies of government, most people have no idea how much governments actually do and how many different things they do and how many people are involved in doing them. And I've discovered little units and parts of governments. And what do you do? Oh, really? I never knew that before. So what are you doing? Well, what's your policy? We're a policy-free zone. I've had people say this to me in government. We're supposed to have policies, but somehow or other they don't work. I was hired by, he was at the emergency services some years ago. They were having a terrible problem because they sometimes call the emergency services departments, it's the fire department, etc., etc. A 100-year-old department with a 14-year-old history, because they've been going forever, but they don't feel like they're public servants. But you've got down in Queen Street here, you have people making policy for the regions. And the policy gets sent out to the regions, gets out to Whoop Whoop or Longreach or wherever, and they look at it and say, what do they know? We do it our way. Yeah? So the policy doesn't get through. So there was this gap between the policy creation and the policy implementation. And they were trying to fill this gap up. And I said, it's a very wide gap. And he said, it's a very wide gap and it's filled with thousands of bodies. It's a problem. What do governments do? A famous theoretician of public servants in America many years ago said, what public servants mostly do is muddle through. Yes, they have policies they can point to and explain why they're doing it, but a lot of the time they're just muddling through. And don't underestimate muddling through. We all do it in our lives, don't we? Do we have policies for our own lives? Sometimes we do. By and large, we're finding our way. Government often is too. And yet they need this. They need this justificatory apparatus, the policy apparatus. Politics is about many things. Politics is the art of compromise, yes, so it is. Politics is about power. And we know we don't trust politicians because they're all power-hungry, kind of Dr. Dooms, aren't they? Trying to rule the world. Aren't they really? Well, we know, people do like power. You see Tony Abbott when he lost it? Poor man. I mean, he was, as someone once said, cock of the walk one day, feather duster the next. It's a terrible, terrible thing to lose power, and no politician likes to lose it. It's a horrible, horrible thing. We've seen it happen several times over the last few years. And the deflationary aspect, Tony's out there trying to build a legacy for himself. See what I did? Malcolm's doing nothing that I didn't already lay the foundations for. He's laying down his legacy because he's lost power. It's very, very crippling and cruel. So politics is about power. It is about power. But the power to do what? Not to order people around or be the biggest bully on the block. Sometimes that's true, but in our system of government, we'd hope that's not true most of the time. The power to do what, actually? Make a difference in what? In whatever. In whatever. Yeah? Which way is Queensland going? Which way is Brisbane going? Which way is Queensland? Which way is Australia going? We're in a bit of a doldrums at the moment. The whole world's in a bit of a doldrums at the moment. How do we get out of those doldrums? Where are we going? How do we create jobs for the next generation? Are our children and this generation's children are going to be worse off or better off than the last one? We are used to this cycle of better off, generation by generation. It's going to happen. Well, it's the government's job to answer these questions. And this is the power to do what? The power to make policy, actually. To make policies, and when you make a policy, it's not just I make a policy for myself. One is that I shave as soon as I get up in the morning. I don't wait, I shave. Why do I do that? Because if I don't, I forget. And then I'll be in a meeting and I'll go, oh my God, I forgot to shave. So long ago I had policy. But that's my policy, who cares? Yeah? But for government, when they make a policy, it's not just for them or your department, it's for everyone. Again, it comes back to your power to impose something on people. And you're serving the people in doing this, of course, but nevertheless you have the power to do this. This is what political power is about. The other part of political power is, the first power, what do we do? And the second part of power is, who gets to say what we do? This is where the elbowing, jostling for power comes in. I want it to be me, not the opposition. I want it to be me, not that guy behind me. As someone once said about a new young man who'd just been elected to Parliament, and he's sitting beside the leader of his party, and he's looking at the opposite bench and says, "Oh, it's great, look at the enemy, we'll get them." And he says, "That's not the enemy, son, the enemy's behind you." And we've seen this illustrated recently, haven't we, very dramatically. Okay, so power's very important, but it's the power to do something, and who gets the say is very important too. Now, talk about our system of government. That's generally speaking when we think about policy. And I'll talk about policy in a little bit more depth a bit later on to see the close relationship between politics and policy. Let's not forget our system of government, as I said before. We're not a tyranny. We're not Saddam Hussein's Iraq. We're not China. We're not even Japan. They're all different forms of systems of government. Some are more related than others. Liberal democracy, America's a liberal democracy, so is Britain, so is Germany, France, so are we, but they're all kind of different too. They're all kind of different. But we all share, the liberal democracies share these principles. We don't, and they're very important principles for the way understanding your job and understanding the way government actually works. Liberalism, you know what liberalism is? And I don't mean, Malcolm Abbott's, Tony Abbott's party. It's not the Liberal Party. They're capital L liberals. Malcolm's a real liberal. That's why the Liberal Party doesn't like him much. He's a real liberal because he believes in liberalism. What is liberalism? No. That's democracy. Liberal. Free. Whose freedom counts? Liberal, liberality, liberal, to be liberated is free. This is like another Latin word. It's freedom, but whose freedom counts? Yours. Yours individually. Our system of government is set up to preserve your individual freedom. Now, not all societies believe this is a very revolutionary concept. It's only a few hundred years old. Most societies believe, no, you do. Government does not exist to serve you and your freedom. You exist to serve your superiors and your society. And by the way, you think you should choose who you're going to marry? No, you shouldn't, because you don't know best for yourself. You think you should choose where you're going to go to university, what job you're going to have to do? No. But you see you're all liberals because you don't question those things. You take it as granted. But actually this is very unusual in world history, that people think like this, that we have a system of government dedicated to preserving your freedom, even freedom from the government itself. This is the problem of liberalism. Liberalism sets up a form of government. Why? Because we don't really trust each other. If you leave human beings in a state of anarchy, well, we can see what happens in Iraq or in Syria. Yeah? We get violence, we get people killing one another, we get unpleasantness of the extreme form. How do we stop people doing that? Well, we set up a very powerful government that whacks people on the head when they try to do it. Government preserves our freedom from our fellow citizens, if you like. But then we set up such a powerful body, it has to be powerful to do that, to enforce laws. It's powerful enough to oppress us, and take away our freedoms. Therefore, we have to build in safeguards. It has to be powerful enough to protect us, but not so powerful it's going to trample on our liberty. That would give up the game. That would be impossible. That's why we have this one, actually, the rule of law, which we'll talk about in a bit. But democracy, what's democracy? That's liberalism. Liberalism, we call ourselves a liberal democracy, but there's two distinct principles going on here. One is liberalism, which I've just talked about, individual freedom. The other is democracy. Another Greek word, demos. Demos just means the people. Kratia, rule of the people. That's it. So this is a political concept. Liberalism is kind of a bit uneasy about politics. It would rather just be left alone. Individuals just get on with it, That government is best which governs least, leaves us alone. Does the necessary but leaves us alone. But democracy, this is about actually the thing I said before, who gets to call the shots? Who has the power? And democracy is not some aristocracy born to rule, not some monarch who's, descended from whoever. Why should that give anyone a right to rule? The people should rule. That's who should rule. So democracy says, actually, the government is your government and you should rule. So we combine these principles. They sort of don't necessarily, they get on, they're kind of wedded to each other historically, and sometimes the wedding can be a bit uneasy. George Bush went into Iraq and into the Middle East, spreading democracy around the world because democracy is a good thing. When it finally got to the Gaza Strip, guess who got elected? A terrorist organization called Hamas, who are anything but liberal. So democracy can produce illiberal outcomes. But we married them together in our system, so they kind of work together. But the rule of law is very important in this for preserving liberal freedoms. Everything you do as a public servant has to be done under some law. You have to be able to point to the statute legislation, which, for the transport and main roads, which allows you to have the authority to have and do the things you do. If you are under the rule of law. And by the way, Malcolm Turnbull, he's the Prime Minister, pretty powerful. But Malcolm's under the rule of law too. If he does something wrong, something criminal, he's up before the courts, just like everyone else. No exceptions in this. Well, there is one exception. We'll talk about that exception a bit later when we look at our system of government. And the separation of powers, again, is another safeguard. It's to make the rule of law correct. Separation of powers means judges. If you go to Malaysia, you might have been, if anyone followed Malaysian politics over recent years, they've got a kind of democracy going on there. But the opposition tends to end up in jail quite a lot because the Prime Minister of Malaysia can go to the judge and say, see him, put him away. Trumped up charge, in jail. 6 years will do. Yeah? Can't do that in our system because judges are very jealous of the separation of powers. If they try to get lent on by politicians, they'll have those politicians up before the courts and put away pretty quick. Judges are very, very jealous of this in our system. So this separation of powers is very, very important. It's so power does not accumulate in any one place. If power accumulates in one body, that body is going to be able to do what they like and oppress you. Judge, juror, executioner. You don't want that. So our system of government is very, very complex, and these principles are very important ones. And we govern under them, actually with great difficulty sometimes, but very important. So we're a principled government already. I always say there's two things that explain any form of government. One is principles, these principles, just that were there before. The other is history. Why is Australia, and we'll have a look at the Australian system of government in a bit, as complicated as it is? History. There's some things you can't explain except that's the way it happened. But you marry these principles to this history and you get you get New Zealand, which is similar system of government, but not the same as ours. Simpler, actually, than ours. Then we've got ours, which is a very complex system of government, federal government. Yeah. Okay, politics and policy. I've had many public servants over the years say this to me. Public servants, I've always found, almost without exception, the public servants, and I've known many of them over the years, to be a very decent lot. I always find them very decent, very sincere, trying to do the best job they can, very sincerely. There are exceptions, of course, that's in everything. But by and large, they are. And some of them are even more than sincere. They're kind of zealous in trying to do a good job and do the public service. But they get very frustrated because, they're told, got to do good things for the people. And the minister will say to you, get me a policy together, take your staff, work out a good policy that will address this problem. Come back to me in 3 months, 6 months. Beaver, yes, we've got it. We've done all the business, got it. Go to the minister and I don't want that anymore. The politics have changed. The winds of politics have blown and everything's changed and don't want to know more. And your first rule, you serve the public through the minister. Because they're elected, you're not. This is another principle of democracy. But you want to serve the public, and the minister doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know his ass from his elbow sometimes. Yeah? Why can't we do the best thing? We can see the best thing, they're not seeing it. Well, you can't. You can't. And if only we could get the politics out of policy. If I had $1 for every time I've had a public servant say this, we'd have much, much better policy. It would be clean, it would be evidence-based. It would be addressing the issue. All would go well. Is that true? Anyone agree with that? If only you could get the politics out of policy.
Good policy is good politics.
Ah, but you see, you're a sophisticated man. You've complicated something already, haven't you?
Worked with politicians for far too long.
But you know, it must be thus. You know, a colleague and I often do inductions for Treasury. Treasury gets all these inductions of graduates who are often engineers or economists or whatever, and they get very special treatment, and they have to learn about the system of government. Sometimes they know nothing about it at all. But it's amazing how little sometimes people, even highly intelligent people, know about government. But I've forgotten what I was going to say now, but never mind. If only we get the politics out of policy, you can't. You can't. Why not? Well, I said, what is policy? We've answered that question. But why can't you get politics out of policy? Now, I know the kind of politics you want to get out of policy. Oh, yes, I know what I was going to say. When we're talking to these inductees, we say, look, we always start off with the Three Gorges Dam in China. You know, that massive dam the Chinese built? It goes for 600 kilometers, this dam. It's massive. It creates such huge waves, there's some danger that it's washing the walls down and it might all fall apart someday. But it was the answer to a policy problem. What do you need in China? We need power, clean power, hydroelectric. We need internal waterways for navigating, etc. Now, we had to move the population of southeast Queensland out of the way to build this dam. Can you imagine that? But they did. Chinese government moved 1.25 million people out of the way and built a dam. Yeah? And this is a perfect policy issue, isn't it? Here's what we need to do it. Here's how we're going to tackle it. Decision made, everything done. How come we can't build a dam, the Traverson Dam in Queensland? Well, we know we need a dam for water. Why is it so? It's irrational, isn't it? And the Chinese think it is. I think you'll never get anything done in a democracy, will you? We need, okay, we've had floods in the last few years, but we had 15 years of drought, and we will again. Where's our water supply? Why didn't we address it with the dam? We couldn't build the dam because people didn't want it in their area, and created such a political storm, complicated politics behind it, but it was politics. Politics prevented the dam, which is good policy, being, and why not? We're a democracy. People do have a say. You can't push people around. You can't just toss them off their property and say, the dam goes here. It's very difficult to do things in a democracy. So we can't get politics out of policy, and there's more reasons for that too. The kind of politics we want to get out is the kind of partisan bickering, I was at a function in Canberra last night, and John Hewson, who was a former Liberal leader, lost to, who did he lose to? Keating, back in 1993. He gave a very good talk, actually, and he was talking about, he said, because he went down because he had good policies. He had 1,000-page policies. He loves policy, John, and he's a very good economist. And he said, people blame me for the short-termism of modern government. Why? Because I wrote all these policies in such detail that it gave the Labor Party something to attack. And the whole thing fell apart, and I lost government and lost the job. And so ever since then, government said, mustn't give them too big a target. Let's not give them much policy. And so he was criticising Tony Abbott, and he said, Abbott, and he said, Abbott, and I nearly said Abbott and Costello, Abbott and Joe Hockey. They come out and say, we're going to do this. No policy thought, no planning, no research, just a thought bubble. He says, it's not the way to do politics. It's wrong. China can plan for the next 100 years. We have trouble planning over a 3-year cycle. And that's the kind of politics just gets in the way, doesn't it, of good policy? It just does get in the way. How do we fix that? I think Malcolm's trying to approach it in a different way. That's why he doesn't want to get pinned down. You're not going to pin me down to a promise here, because I don't know what I can achieve and how long it's going to take to achieve it. But trust me, I'm going to try and get something done. You've got to navigate your way through this difficult partisan politics, because you've got someone out there whose whole fortune rests on you looking stupid and losing and getting caught in what turns out to be a lie because you promised something you couldn't deliver. This is a very, very difficult political system to navigate and negotiate, but it has to be done. If we could get that kind of politics out, it would be kind of good, wouldn't it? Really. If we had bipartisanship on really important matters that are fundamental to Australia, to Queensland. So, even if we could, though, even if we could, this is a definition from Lynn Davis, who used to be, he's now the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, but he used to be Peter Beattie's government. He was the head of Premiers and Cabinet for quite a while. And this is a book that he and others wrote. And this is not really a definition of policy, but it's an interesting characterization of policy. Public policy is a complex interplay of values, interests, and resources. Policies express values, support and curtail interests, and distribute resources. They shape and are shaped by, this is an interesting sentence, they shape and are shaped by the constituent elements of politics, so that policies represent victories or compromises encapsulated as programs for action by government. There are many, many books, policy after the Second World War. Many American academics who had a large hand in war planning thought, well, we could win a war. Why can't we apply our skills and planning skills to the peace, to make world peace, to get rid of poverty, etc., etc. And their kind of model of what policy should look like was what I'm talking about before. Sensible, reasoned policy aimed at doing the best thing without all this messy politics ruining it all the time. And they had what was called the engineering of model of policy. What do we need to get done? What's the problem? Here's how we address it. Next stage, what's the options that we can put up? What's it going to cost? Cost-benefit analysis. Here's the result at the end. That's the best thing. Let's go do it. And there was only one problem with that. It sounds like a kind of a mathematical puzzle, doesn't it? It's a problem. We solve it. Problems have solutions. Simple. And yet, if you look at that sentence, it says, no, policies represent not solutions, victories or compromises. It's more like a football game. We played better, but we lost. Too bad. You lost. Yeah? And this happens in policy. Every policy that you have ever heard of is an outcome of a political process in which there was giving, there was taking, there was winners, there was losers. Never comes out precisely as anyone planned it in their perfect world where everything comes out correct. There's no kind of solutions. There are answers to policies, to policy problems, but there are no things. But have a look at this politics here. The elements of policy. This is the first part of Lynn's sentence. Values, interests, and resources. Think about it. Can you think of a policy that doesn't express a value? No, you can't. Contradiction in terms, because you only have policy to achieve something that you think's good to achieve. Yeah? Otherwise, no point in a policy. You wouldn't be able to defend a policy if you couldn't point to what it was doing that was good. So values are an intrinsic part of policy. What's the problem with values? Subjective, which means that my values, I know my values are correct, but I'm not sure about yours. We differ, don't we? Yeah. Some people have, hey, Paris a couple of days ago. Those people, I guess they have values. They have values, but they're pretty monstrous. We certainly don't share them, and force us into a conflict of values, and not just values of bodies. But even in our benign, relatively benign Australian context, it's not even that I disagree with you or you disagree with me. We disagree with the priority. We all have the same values, but we have to prioritise values, don't we? I used to live in London. I used to come back to visit my dad who lived in Noosa, and I'd stand up on Noosa Heads there and look up towards Double Line and point, God, paradise, after living in London. Like, paradise. Everyone's going to want a piece of this. Paved paradise, you know. And that's the problem, isn't it? We want even, it's not just that we're divided amongst ourselves, we're divided in ourselves. And you're transporting main roads, for heaven's sake. Yeah? We want to keep this pristine beauty precisely as it is. We want the barrier reef to stay the barrier reef. We also want development. And we want tourism to come in here, which will change this thing we love and this thing we need. We cannot have everything, and yet we have to find a balance. How do we decide this? Well, I'm telling you, there is no formula that will give you an answer to that. It will be a matter of politics. It will be decided by arguing about values, arguing about balance, arguing about priorities, and something will come out at the end of it. And there'll be a bit of power play going on there too. Someone will get their way, someone won't get their way so much. That's the nature of it. But it can't be got rid of. You can't get rid of the value thing, which there is no mathematical answer for. What about interests? As Lynn says, policies express interests. And they express some people's interests more than others, perhaps, you know. The farmers at the moment are complaining about, well, some of them are, about the drilling on their land for coal seam gas, aren't they? What about the water table? What about the arable land for future generations, yeah? Okay, so you're making money out of gas, hopefully, a bit of it, and it's cleaner than coal, therefore it's good. So you've got all these, their values, of course, going on there. But there's interest at stake here. The farmer does not see their interest. Some of them do. They get bought off by the coal seam gas company. Oh, yes, my interest, I've got more money. But others say, no, absolutely not. And so you get some interest being served by this new development, coal seam gas, some interests that are being threatened by it. Whose interest will prevail at the end of the day? Is there a mathematical answer to that? No, there's not. Only decided by politics. And again, this is why you can't get politics out of policy. Not just partisan politics, but politics, real politics about what gets done and who gets to say and who gets an influence. Resources, main roads, what's it cost to build a mile of highway? Depends where it is and how many lanes, but it's a lot. So,
1,000 per kilometre in the sticks and about $1 million per kilometre not in the sticks.
That's a pretty good bargain, actually. $1 million a kilometre. That's you know, if you've got to go 500 kilometres, there you are.
Yeah, it's 2 lane depending on geotech and specification.
See, he's got it all at his fingertips. Resources. It's costly. Building a road, infrastructure is so important, all the politicians tell you it is. It's the foundation of our future prosperity. But it's expensive too. Which infrastructure projects are going to go ahead? How much resources are they going to take up? Are they going to be well spent or badly spent? Yeah. Not only that, resources, it's not that policies cost, which they generally do, but sometimes policies can alter distributions amongst people. You know, once upon a time, Australia, not that many years ago, back in the pre-1980s, let's say, when we still rode on the sheep's back somewhat, a government, Australian government, and a Labor one at that, came in and said, we cannot go on. We fell off the sheep's back. No one wants our wool anymore. We cannot afford to be our old Australian self. We have to bring down the tariff barriers. We used to have 250,000 people working in clothing, textile, and footwear. Now we have somewhere around 30,000. Why? Because government had a policy. They knew they were going to put all those people out of work. Why? It's cheaper. You don't wear Australian anymore, do you? But 40 years ago, everyone in this room would be wearing Australian. Now you don't. Why? That's a result of government policy. A lot of people lost their jobs. Government policy redistributes resources. It puts some people out of work, it gives some people other work. So policy is never neutral, almost never neutral. You know, they try to make it balanced and all that kind of stuff. If we get the GST in the next couple of years, you can see Malcolm saying, it's got to be fair. The poorer people are going to be hit. They spend more money on their ordinary day-to-day life than rich people. We have to compensate them. It's going to be fair. You see, he's balancing already. He's already politically balancing this redistributive effect of policy. Is there an answer to who gets resources, who gets winners, who the winners are, who the losers are? Is there a mathematical equation that will answer this? Of course there's not. There's only the political process which will sort it out down the line. For these reasons, all these three things are essential to policy, central to policy. You can never take the politics out of policy. It's only through politics policy can get done at all. But you see how difficult it is. And you see why, if we come back to Aristotle's prudence, how important it is to think about all these complexities and to think, when you're doing something, what has to be balanced against what? Who do I have to listen to? Who's a danger to my policy? Who do I have to buy off? Who do I have to consult? Etc., etc., etc. Endless number of questions. Not even outside there in the world. Who in the next department is going to object to my policy and possibly undermine it? And how do I prevent that? You're living in a complex world. This is a complex policy world, and it makes it very difficult. And it requires precisely, and here's the complex policy world. This is a simplified diagram of the Australian political system. Are you impressed? Simplified because over there, oops. Oh, back. Hey, we'll come to that in a bit. Don't get too excited. I'll try to hit this without my thumb. That is the Commonwealth government, the federals. We have a federal system of government. We love politicians so much. We have 15 houses of parliament in Australia for 23 million people. That's a lot of pollies we're paying because we love them a lot. No, that's not true. It's because we're a federal system. We used to be colonies, and all the colonies had power, and they didn't want to give it up when we formed this new thing called Australia, Commonwealth of Australia. We had to have another layer. That's why I've just been to Canberra. I've seen it down there. We have a layer of politicians down there for the whole of Australia. But Queensland still had its own government. New South Wales still has its own government, etc., etc., etc. And this is a typical, or supposedly a typical, state government. Except it's not Queensland. Why not? Exactly. Queensland got rid of its upper house in 1922. Interesting story. They abolished themselves. You can ask me later. But you look at all these, and this is really is simplified, all these bodies. If you have a federal system of government, you've divided power. There's power at the centre, but there's also power in the states. And then there's the poor local governments who haven't got much power at all and feel bullied all the time. Except for Brisbane City Council, maybe, because it's very big. But there you are. You have to get on. How does Australia have a policy that's an Australian policy? For, hey, environment. Do you think the environment cares where the New South Wales border begins and ends? Look at the Murray-Darling system. How many states does that touch and cross? Why can't we get a sensible policy that keeps the Murray-Darling system alive and still provides farms along the way with sufficient water to grow their crops and so forth? Why? Because we're a federal system. And Victoria won't have it. New South Wales will have it. Poor old South Australia down the end of the river gets the bum end of the stick. Yeah? Because we're a federal system. It's very hard to do anything, hard to do sensible policy in this system. I said before that all the people who occupy the system are under the law because of the rule of law, but there's one person in this diagram who's not, actually. Who? The Queen. There she is. She's the head of state, our state. She lives in England, but she's our head of state. Again, this is history. This is not principle, this is history. And she is not under the rule of law. She can do murder, and they can't prosecute her. She pays taxes now, but she didn't used to. She's one of the richest people in the world and never paid any tax. But the Sun newspaper created a big stink some years ago, and she said, well, in that case, I will pay some taxes. And she does, purely voluntarily. They can't make her pay taxes, she does it herself. Now, we know that Malcolm Turnbull, and Bill Shorten too, if he ever got his way, would like to chop that bit off, actually. Get rid of this old anachronistic piece of British history and say, no, we're Australians, come on. Let's finally be Australians and stand on our own 2 feet once for all. It's going to be a bit more complicated than they think it is, but that's what they'd like to do. Get rid of that anomaly. Otherwise, hey, we're a republic for all intents and purposes. We also have this little body here, right? Small, 7 judges, but very, very powerful. It's had a huge say in the history of Australia in how Australia actually gets governed. If you look at our constitution, 1901, it reads pretty much the same now as it did then, but Australia's in a completely different place. And its differences have largely been determined by decisions made in the High Court, but I won't go into that here. But this is the complex environment. You are in a state, but you have a lot to do, and a lot of your funds, I presume, will come from Commonwealth. Commonwealth gives grants to the states. Sometimes they're free grants, but sometimes they're tied grants. The Commonwealth government to tell you what to do with this money. You want $15 billion for the Ipswich bypass? Build it the way I say. Now, wait a sec. Road building's a state matter, not a federal matter. But if I give you money and tell you what to do, you'll do it, won't you? Otherwise,
I'll take the money.
yeah, that's right. So I'm not having you $15 billion. Tell me what to do. Okay. What this comes down to is that you are not allowed to be, you're supposed to be apolitical, but you can't be. You're not allowed to use the photocopier to print off Labour Party advertising. That would be illegal and you'll be prosecuted. You're not allowed to be partisan in your job, and you've got to serve the government of the day. We've had a change of government just recently, very surprisingly. And you have to serve the Labour government just as you faithfully served the Campbell-Newman LNP government. That is part of the contract that you have and the legislation. You must do that. Therefore, public servants often get confused about this. They say, yeah, but my job is really, really quite political. And you have to be politically very sensitive to do it. And if you're involved in policy at all, and these days, once upon a time you wouldn't be involved in policy, you would do it too low down the ladder, but nowadays nearly every public servant of any note is involved somewhere along the policy process. So I say this, you must be political, and you must, Neil's just given you a perfect example before. He said before, the good policy is the policy that will get up politically. And that's fundamental. That's fundamental. It can be the most brilliant policy in the world. If it never gets up, never gets funded, never gets instantiated, never gets implemented, so what? How do you do that? Well, you've got to be politically pretty savvy. I had a treasurer, one of the people from the Treasury in Canberra at a class a few years ago, and he was saying, look, it's coming up for budget time, and I've asked people for programs, projects. Bring them to me. I'll see what we can fund. And he said, I got about 1,000, of which 90% were really quite good and worthwhile and valuable and would have done good things. He said, I had money to fund 10% of them. And one of my the students in the class said, well, how do you choose in that case? If you can't choose on quality and merit, what do you choose? He says, you've got to convince me there's political pain in my not funding you. In other words, politics. Convince the minister, hey, don't fund that one, and you'll end up in somewhere, you don't want to be. So that was interesting, coming from someone in Treasury. Politics 1, politics 2, politics 3. Politics 1 is what we were talking about before when we were looking at the whole system of government, the way it works. It's principles, those principles I showed you before, but also that complex institutional structure, which we've inherited in the federal system. That's the big politics. And you're all part of that because, you have to survive within the system. States argue with states, and states argue with the federal government, and the poor old local government tries to stop being amalgamated and argues with everyone, et cetera, et cetera. Politics 2 is kind of meso, the middle level politics. You have your DG here, and who's your minister now?
Two ministers, Minister Track for Transport.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Oh, that's a curious arrangement, isn't it? Do you know how important your ministers are?
They're very important.
To you, but on the scale of things, who's the most important one?
Deputy Premier.
Why?
She's the second most powerful politician in the state.
And who's the third?
Treasurer.
How do you know that? Is it written down somewhere in the rules?
Convention.
It's not even a convention, it's just a fact. You know how powerful Treasury is, because if you want anything done, you have to go to Treasury and get it costed and fund it. And they can say no. Power. And they're very small. Huge departments like health or education, they're massive, but powerful? Not really when you compare them to Treasury. Now, you know that. That's politics too. That's the middle kind of level of politics, where, in state politics, who sits where at the cabinet table? Who gets listened to in cabinet? Yeah? Who among public servants, all the DGs, who gets listened to there? Or are there these these non-appointed advisors, the Peter Credlins of the world? She seemed to be pretty important. She's not a public servant. She's not elected, and yet she was very powerful. Politics 2. Politics 1 is This is the lowest level you can get. Whose politics won? Guess. To whom does it apply? You. You. Yeah? You've got to survive in this business, haven't you? How's your workmates? Who do you have to work with? Do you like them? How do you get on with your boss, your supervisor? They good? They useless? Yeah? How do you get on with your DG? Oh, sorry, I didn't say that. Admirable fellow, or is he on the way up or on the way out? Just waiting for retirement. Yeah? When you have a task to do, guess what? You all have KPIs, don't you? Have you ever seen a KPI you couldn't meet? Of course not, because you write them that way. That's politics one. You've got to cover your own ass. But you also want to get, you're sincere public servants too. You want to get things done. But you don't want to be destroyed in the process. That's politics one. Politics goes all the way down. They're all connected, of course, interconnected. So don't think, when people say you've got to be apolitical, don't think it's actually possible. It's not. You've got to be politically actually very savvy. You can't do the partisan stuff. No, you can't do that. But you've got to know which way the political winds are blowing. You've got to know when your minister speaks, whether they're speaking with the voice of Moses or the voice of Minnie Mouse. Yeah. Whether it's really serious. Because the winds of politics are pretty chaotic. And when they blow, they have a thing called disaster policy. What disaster policy is, you have a Childers fire where 15 people die, and all of a sudden you have to have policy to cover backpackers associations. Yeah? These things happen. Politics throws all sorts of things at you. And the winds of politics are very strange indeed. And you have to be... What did Christopher Pine said he was? Oh, he's a fixer, but he was also, after he shifted camps, nimble. Nimble. And indeed, you actually have to be quite nimble. You have to be canny, you have to be quite clever. Transport and main roads, how does this all apply to you? Is there any ethical issues? As, a colleague of mine used to say, oh yes, main roads. Lay it flat and lay it black. Otherwise, who cares? That's it. Nothing much to that. It's say, well, is it that simple? Of course it's not that simple, is it? Actually, when Peter Beattie was in power, he was doing his joined-up government. That was the flavour of the year. And government was all going in, move this whole beast in one direction. Yeah, we're all going to be environmental, and every department had to respond to, what are you doing about the environment, environmental protection? And main roads come back and said, we got nothing to do with the environment. Oh, no. Trucks, environment, building roads, and environment. But they meant it. Yeah. Interesting looking around today. I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I came, but it's very interesting. I'm pretty sure if I'd been here 20 years ago, Neil, I'd just be a pretty blokey congregation. There would not be many women here, but there are women here now, and quite a few of you. And this is not enough yet. Sorry, there never are enough yet, are there? But you see the change. You see the change. Now, this is an ethical organisational issue, which is being clearly addressed in main roads, as it is in other parts, as it is in our armed forces, for heaven's sake. Scandals occur and it becomes an ethical issue. The ethical issue becomes a political issue. Political issue has to be addressed. So you, like all other departments, there's an political issue which is being addressed. But environment versus infrastructure, what I was saying before. Of course we want infrastructure, of course we want development, but it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost. What cost are we willing to bear? How do we work that out? How do we work that out, not just for this generation, and this is the problem, isn't it? We've got to think not just for ourselves, but for our children's, our grandchildren's generation. This is ethics of a complex and large scale, actually, you're being asked to think about in your decision making as a department and individually within that department. Culture versus infrastructure, we'll talk about that in a minute. Roads versus rail, all sorts of things. You'll be able to tell me what this is, I'm sure. What is that? Sorry? Yes, because it's not real, is it? It's an artist's impression of what it's going to look like. Yeah, because it doesn't start getting built till next year, is it? 2018 will be finished. It's going to cost 1.6 billion. Toowoomba's very happy about it because they're expecting to bring a couple of billion worth of work and income to the region, to Toowoomba. And of course, it well needed this. I used to live in Toowoomba. I grew up there. And coming down the old range, that was hairy. A lot of deaths down that road, till they got the new road down. But yes, of course, this is going to be absolutely essential infrastructure. Costly, but and there it is. You can see the Warrego Highway. You can see where it's going to leave. It's going to actually go right round Toowoomba. So you won't have to go down Margaret Street and through Toowoomba anymore. You'll be able to go right round. Very, very sensible. But of course, who's that? Anyone know who that is?
Yes, I know who that is.
Yes, I thought you might.
He's the grandson of...
Neville Bonner. Yeah. He was first Aboriginal senator, first Aboriginal elected to the Senate in Australia.
He is in Toowoomba saying that is an Aboriginal site.
That's right.
When it is not his country, and it is not his site.
Yeah. But you see, James Bonner, I think is his name. I think he's an archaeologist, is he? A bona fide archaeologist? Whatever. He's leading a team of archaeologists, and they claim that where it goes off the Warrego Highway at Helidon there are important Aboriginal sites, this one being a lookout, apparently. But apparently there's supposed to be other old rock paintings, but he wants a chance to excavate it. And surely you can build your road just a little bit to avoid these sites, yeah? Now, the department, probably you, Neil, have come out and say, no, we've investigated this and there's no problem here, and if there are any artefacts, and there are artefacts being dug up from 20,000 years ago, and so we'll put them in a museum or whatever. But the road's going ahead. But you see that building a road is, and even when it's a sensible thing to do, and an infrastructurally sensible thing to do, a necessary thing to do, you're going to run into these unexpected things, which you have to... I don't think James is going to win this battle, but he's putting up a battle. He's on radio there last week, expounding at great length, and there's lots of people out there. They're going to say that because they distrust government. Of course, government just walks over everyone, don't they? And he's making a reasonable case. Many people are going to listen to and say, oh, and it's going to make life difficult, potentially, for you. Yep. There you are. See, that's politics. And you can't foresee necessarily where this is going to happen, how it's going to happen, what the rights and wrongs really are. You're going to have to sort that out. But it's going to happen. It always happens. It will happen. It happens at every stage and every move. And you have to be, yes, canny, nimble. Sometimes you have to be downright untransparent, possibly. And just for the sake of it, let's finish with Calvin. Explain Newton's first law of motion in your own word. Idea. I love loopholes. Just because you can. It's a very fast response, this thing, isn't it? There we go. So thank you very much.